Hello, my name is Tanaya Morgan, and this will be my last recording for my public speaking class. Today I'm going to be doing a self evaluation on one of the speeches that I previously did in the class. For the assignment, I chose to reflect on the very first speech that we did, which was a commemorative speech. I chose to do mine as a graduation speech. So I'm just going to start by summarizing the content that was in that speech. So for the intro, the beginning of the speech was centered around hooking the audience. I wanted to make sure that there was a level of formality and informality with my language, so I tried to keep it universal but also relatable. I made it a point to recognize the hardships and milestones that my classmates and I faced and achieved as we began the next journey in our lives. I also wanted to compare the trajectory of the life of someone who has a plan for their future and someone who may not be so sure of their future with one another. I wanted to reassure everyone that it was okay to be on either side of the spaces, regardless. And I even encouraged them to take a moment to visualize what their future might look like. So I thought that was a really good way to engage with the audience. I also included my personal feelings about the future, and I established that regardless of the person that you are in the comparison example, that you're bound to feel some sense of instability when it came to visualizing what your future would be like. I also went on to state my thesis, which was to consider three important things, which was discovering what you're passionate about, holding positivity over doubt, and remaining thankful to yourself and those who support you. I was hoping that this would get my audience to think about what's to come in the remainder of my speech. And at the very end of my introduction, I expressed how confused I felt despite trying my best to think about what I really wanted my future to look like. I talked about how I was able to reassure myself and become more comfortable with the idea of it rather than fearing it, which was another way I thought I was able to connect with the audience really well. I also talked about it with my classmates, and it also made me realize that I wasn't alone. So, closing the introduction, this is where I began to talk about my first point, which was discovering what you're passionate about. So, transitioning into the first paragraph of my speech, I talked about discovering your passions in life. And with that, I made 3 points, which was, and the first was to not be afraid to try something new. I talked about how I was always encouraged by outside influences, whether it be people, places, things, that sort of thing, that you should always try something new, and that the worst that could happen would probably be that you wouldn't enjoy it and you can move on to the next thing. I thought that this point was super important because you needed to be reassured that there are always bigger and better things waiting for you regardless. Even if that seems like it's out of your hands or out of the possible realm of your reality. I dreamed about how it ultimately encouraged me to achieve greater things. And it was one of the many ways I knew I could relate the audience to me on a base level, sorry. The second point that was under this topic was that you could be passionate about more than one thing. I wanted to emphasize that your options were never limited, especially when it came to the things that you loved. I talked about how I came to understand what it meant as I was told to think differently about it going through my high school career. And after following what I truly thought was best for me, I was able to figure out what felt right. And the third point was to let your passions drive you to achieve greater things. And with this, I wanted to encourage my audience to follow their dreams and do everything that they desired. And I stated that there are examples of how this could turn out positively for many people, and that it is everywhere, whether we chose to acknowledge it or not. Now, the second point was positivity should be something that makes you an overcomer of doubt. So, transitioning into the second part of my speech, I posed this point, and I felt like this part of the speech really supported the motivation aspect of it. There were also three key pieces of this advice that I emphasized in regards to the topic. To remind yourself that there is light at the end of the tunnel, and to always choose to believe and invest in yourself even if no one else would. And there was a quote by Susie Kasim, I think that's how you pronounce it, that really resonated with me during the entire process. And the quote is, doubt kills more dreams than failure ever will. So there was also another common phrase that I brought up, which was there's light at the end of the tunnel, in order to really connect on a more informal level with the audience and give them a sense of familiarity. I emphasize that is true for many, if not all people, and that is mainly in regards to mentality rather than physicality. And I noted that it was something I looked to throughout my high school career, and that the choices you make are ultimately yours, and that they can determine the outcome of many things for you. I also encourage my audience to be their biggest fan in the good and bad times and to know their worth in the end, because many things can get in the way of that. And as far as the quote goes, it was something that inspired me with every conflict that I faced when it came to talking about my future and what I thought it would look like. I expressed that I had a lot of doubt, like the audience might have, so I could relate to them in that way, and that you shouldn't doubt the variety of possibilities set out for you before you decide to take a chance. So I also warned them of the consequences that could come with doing that, and that would be beneficial in many ways as well. The transitioning to the third part of my speech, I stated that you should remain thankful to yourself and those who have supported you. So this also can contain two major points that I firmly believe in. And it's the fact that you would not be where you are today if you did not uphold yourself, and to let the people you surround yourself with and to let the people that you surround yourself with be your biggest supporter. Sorry. And I wanted to make it a point that this was the biggest piece of motivation for me, because it reminded me that I wasn't alone, even though it felt like I was most of the time, and that I could have ended up in so many other situations, but this was the one that I ended up in, and for that, I was thankful in many ways, both to myself and for the people that I connected with along the way. And I noted that being there for yourself could play the biggest role in reassuring yourself when it came to making difficult decisions, which there's a lot of when it comes to planning out your life and deciding what works for you and what doesn't work for you. And I also made a connection to what a a close family member often told me, and how it's a prime example of what a good support system could do for you. Because I know a lot of people don't have that. And the importance of surrounding yourself with good energy was one of the many life lessons that I stuck with and wanted my audience to look into as well. So I made sure to add that portion in there as well. And as far as the conclusion of my speech goes, I wrapped it up by reiterating what I discussed throughout my speech, which were those three motivational points and the connection between the audience and those motivational points, as well as myself. So I left the audience to reflect on the past 4 years of their life and what they could do differently in regards to mentality and overall projection when it comes to determining how secure they would be with their future. Now that I summarized my speech, I wanted to talk a little bit about what I think I did well. So, since the speech was a little more informal, I feel like compared to the other two, I think it was a lot easier to treat it as a conversation and a general speech. I was able to connect with the audience on various levels and use communication that was easy for both parties to understand. I feel like my use of language was put into my speech, and it was very clear, and it indicated what I wanted to convey, some being more important than others. I think that I also did really well in specifying and supporting each motivational point to my overall topic, and I made sure to add in personal connections and emotions that may help the audience get a better sense of what I was encouraging them to do, which was to become more comfortable about being unsure about their future. And I also think that I embraced the meaning of what it means to perform a commemorative speech very well. Despite the fact that the speech was formatted virtually, I wanted to make it feel as though my audience was actually there. So I added like clapping sound effects, and I asked them to participate in activities that would allow them to get a better idea of what I wanted them to take away from my speech. In some instances, I maintained eye contact, but I also made sure to remain on track with the overall organization of my speech, with the use of transitional words and the tone that I use in my voice. Now, I want to talk about what I struggled with the most in my speech. So, despite the fact that I think this was one of the best speeches that I did out of the three, I think that I definitely struggled with trying not to read directly from a draft. In public speaking, I learned that you should have footnotes to refer to when giving your actual speech, so it seems like you're more prepared. And so when I did the speech, I had an entire word for word draft laid out for me. And this was usually because when I get really nervous, I forget what I need to say. So that kind of helps me keep going with my speech and stay on track. So I had to adjust my tone and mannerisms to make it seem like I wasn't reading from a script. But in the end, I feel like it did kind of give an unprofessional image on my part. And not only that, but I feel like it might have been a bit distracting and would lead the audience to lose interest in my speech. Some parts I read too fast and other parts I read too slow. So I feel like the overall pace of the speech could have flowed better if I didn't read directly from a script. But eye contact was another big thing I struggled with. My eyes were mainly focused on the script. Even now I'm kind of doing it, but I'm still learning. But it was focused on the script rather than the audience. And sometimes I wandered off to other places since I was recording in a room and my roommate was right in front of me. So I learned that anyone can read from something, but to have your own ideas and words flow in a way that is naturally captivating to the audience is something that really makes a speech impactful. So the atmosphere was also a bit awkward because I recorded it in my dorm room, like I mentioned earlier. So it was kind of hard to also visualize like a proper setting. Like I said, I did a graduation speech, so it's kind of hard to visualize being in a setting where a bunch of my classmates and parents and friends and everyone from all around were just there to support. So as far as discussing the comparison of some of the skills that were portrayed in my recent speeches compared to this one, I feel like in my other speeches, like the persuasive and the informative ones, my skills were kind of deteriorated, and it became increasingly apparent that it was severely structured. Like I said, I kept the script thing going. I kept reading off of a script for most of it. Even though it did help me stay on track most of the time, it still seemed kind of like off-paced, and you could kind of tell. Since they were designed to be a bit more structured, I naturally gravitated towards keeping it that way. But like I said before, it didn't really work out in some of the aspects, like the overall visuals and meaning for the speeches. So in my persuasive speech, I had good words written down, but in public speaking, it's really all about how you convey your message. And in persuasive speeches, you want to maintain firm eye contact and a stable connection with the audience. This way, they're able to be convinced of whatever it is you're trying to tell them to believe or do. And in my informative speech, I feel like this showed a lot more because I had all of my statistics cited, all my statistics and my cited information in there, and it was in a paper format, like an essay, rather than a speech format with like bullet points and things like that. So sometimes I even had the tendency to write too much, which often put me over the time limit for the speech. Even though that didn't really affect my grade much, it kind of stressed me out a bit. So that didn't really work out in my favor either. But I feel like I should have just made a note of when I needed to orally cite things and elaborate on them from there. So my speech would have sounded a lot better and flowed better and would have had a better impact on my persuasive and informative speeches, like it did in my commemorative speech. I think my recent speeches resemble my first speech in the sense that I was able to get through it and maintain a good use of language. I've always been really good at writing, so when it came to organizing the content of my speeches, I didn't really have a problem with doing that. And I think that was the most noticeable facet of my speeches, despite them being written in different contexts. And the last thing I wanted to go over was 2 things that I wanted to improve on in my future speeches, which is eye contact and body language. In my speeches, my eyes weren't really fully engaged with the audience for most of the time that I presented. It's kind of like now, I notice it, but it's kind of hard to break out of that habit. And I also feel like they would really hit home if I made the necessary changes to make my speeches better in those aspects. Eyes can convey the things that you aren't trying to say or are saying, but on a deeper level. So I feel like making an effort to enhance this part of my speech would be beneficial in many ways. And as far as my body language goes, I would like to not be so awkward. I feel like I was very stiff and awkward after I finished reading from my script. I feel like my posture was very uninviting and gave the impression that I wanted to get my speeches over with, which is partially true. But I feel like that also shouldn't be noticeable to the audience if I'm doing that. My body language plays a huge role in public speaking and can also provide some of the same things for your overall message, like maintaining good eye contact with the audience or having a more relaxed posture, which can make it look like, you're more confident in what you're saying and that your audience should have a better reason to listen to what you have to say, which I feel like would have been really beneficial for the persuasive and informative speeches, especially because I feel like there's a lot of information to be digested by the audience, and you really want to keep them captivated in those moments. But other than that, I think that's it for my self-evaluation. I learned a lot from this class, and I think that I could learn even more in the future. So yeah, that's it. Thank you for listening.